Greetings, one and all, to the most cursed, most cringiest corner of the internet. A YouTube channel content creator, actively alienating everyone in both the analog and digital worlds. Welcome and good evening, you wonderful dice of all alignments. I am Lunar D8, and this is Jack. Deacon loved yard sales. Yet despite the size of the neighborhood sale he'd found on his way home from work, nothing had caught his eye. Disappointed, but glad he'd stop anyway, Deacon turned around the table. He had been going through and tripped over something at his feet. With a few ungraceful steps and a hop, he managed to keep himself upright, and looked to see what he had stumbled over, at the same time choosing to ignore the amused looks and snickers of his fellow treasure seekers. Acting as though nothing had happened, he bent over and picked up the object that had been carelessly left behind. It was a simple box covered in a thin, tight layer of old dark leather, approximately 18 inches by 18 inches by 18 inches, with a brass latch and a pin, securing a circular lid in its top, as well as brass trimming and a crank on the right side. The design was clearly that of a jack-in-the-box, a common children's toy that when turning the crank produced a tinny song and a cheap scare, as an overly made-up clown or jester popped up through the song's completion. This, though, was not your average jack-in-the-box. Typically, the toy, now mass-produced in various warehouses across the world, was made out of pressed tin, was feather-light, and about half the size. Also, Deacon could not recall ever seeing one that latched shut. What was the purpose in that? It would ruin the scare if the clown couldn't pop out at the appropriate time. He tried to pull the brass pin out, but it was stuck and refused to budge even a hair. The result was the same with the crank. As well as despite his efforts, he couldn't get it to produce even a single musical note. Even though the toy didn't work, it intrigued Deacon. It was clearly old and probably needed some repairs, but he was willing to bet that even in its current state it was worth some money. He turned the heavy box around looking for a price sticker but couldn't find one. Someone here must be selling it. Perhaps a kid had taken the sticker off in hopes of playing with it. He carried the jack-in-the-box to the only table with someone sitting at it. A rail-thin middle-aged woman with long, extremely frazzled hair and tired blue eyes. Sat with a clipboard and a metal box, exchanging various odds and ends for cash. He waited patiently behind 3 young boys who were debating the value of a box of sports cards. When they finally agreed upon a price, they paid for their cards and moved on. The woman at the table looked at him with such exasperation he was sure she was going to demand to know what he wanted. He was surprised, though, when her expression softened. "Can I help you?" "I can't seem to find a price on this thing. Do you know how much it is?" He held the jack-in-the-box out for her to see, but not far enough for her to take it from him. "What is it?" She tilted her head, but saw nothing but an old box. "A broken jack-in-the-box." He turned the box enough to let her see the crank on the side. "You want to buy a broken toy? And a dirty one at that." She sneered at the box in his hands, mistaking the aged leather for stains. Deacon shrugged, eager to make the purchase, but not wanting to let his excitement apparent. No need in letting on what he thought might be worth more than a few dollars. "A project, really. I like to repair things in my spare time." "Oh, a handyman," she said with a smile. "Well, I'll tell you what. Seeing as it's not marked, let's say $5. It'll go in the donation fund for the animal shelter, my favorite charity." "Sounds fair," Deacon agreed. Paying her for this new treasure, he hurriedly headed for his car, eager to get home and see what he could do with the toy. An hour yet he had yet to locate any information on this particular Jack-in-the-Box. There was no manufacturer stamp, no signature, nor initialing of any kind to indicate who might have made the toy. He was surprised, though, when examining the box, for at least the fourth time since bringing it home, to find a pentagram surrounded by Latin on the bottom. The sinister star in Latin were burned into the otherwise soft leather covering. He hadn't noticed it earlier, and wasn't sure how he could have missed it, but it was clear as day now. In his excitement over its age and potential profit, he must have overlooked it as he reasoned. The pentagram certainly added to the mystery of the toy, and he had hoped that Jack-in-the-Box uniqueness would make it easy to locate information about it, but it was quickly becoming apparent that maybe its uniqueness was the very thing holding up his search. Frustrated, but not discouraged, he began yet another search when he heard the front door open. "Hi, honey," he called out to the other person who had a key to his home. His girlfriend of 2 years, Melanie. "Hey, baby," she answered from the hallway, as she stripped out of her jacket and shoes and dropped her purse before joining him on the couch, planting a kiss on his cheek. Deacon set his laptop aside, turned his head, and eagerly returned his kiss. "How was your day?" he asked. "Oh, you know, long, drawn out, and uneventful. Glad it's over," she laughed, tossing her dark hair over her shoulder and cuddling up to Deacon. "What's that?" Deacon reached over and picked up the toy. "Well, I picked this up on the way home from work. Pretty sure it's a Jack-in-the-Box." "Pretty sure?" she asked quizzically, looking as if she couldn't think of anything else it could be. "Well, the crank won't turn, and I can't get the pin out of the latch." He shrugged and handed the box to Melanie. "But it's obviously old, so even if I gotta get some work done to get it in working order, I think I can make some money off of it. I've been searching online ever since I got home." Melanie turned the box over to examine. Nothing, the pentagram and Latin before, setting the heavy box on her knees and rubbing her fingers together, surprised and a little disgusted by the soft texture of its surface. "Weird, huh? It's covered in some type of leather. It's definitely not made out of a person, but that's got to make it even more rarer. Never seen one like that before. There's a reason for that." Deacon grinned hopefully. Melanie nodded in agreement. "What does Latin say?" "I'm not entirely sure. I put it through a translator, but it makes no sense. Something about music and a sleeper?" That's certainly ominous." "What about these?" she asked, pointing to the metal caps on the box's corners. Deacon leaned closer and noted that every three-sided cap engraved on each flat surface was the number 6, so that each corner read 666. He stared at a moment in disbelief. How could he have missed that as well as the pentagram? Maybe it was time to go have his eyes examined, he thought. Ruefully, "I didn't even see those. I'm not surprised. Not something you usually see on a toy," Melanie said distastefully. "Well, it kind of makes sense," Deacon said, straight up. "The original toy had been traced back to the 16th century German clockmaker who got the idea from the 13th century churchman, who said to protect the city of Buckinghamshire by casting a devil into a boot. The clockmaker took this legend and created the devil in a box for the son of a local prince. When he turned the crank, a simple tune played, and at the end a comically painted devil popped out and surprised everyone. It was instantly popular, and all the nobles wanted their own devil in the box." "That sounds like a very boring time to live in if that's the most excitement you have." It's like, "I have Dragon Ball Z. It's much better." Sometime during the Renaissance, the devil was replaced with a jester, and the toy became known as a Jack-in-the-Box. Jack was the old nickname for the devil, so it meant the same thing. But it seemed to have more appeal to people in that way, Deacon explained. "Creepy." Melanie sneered as she picked it up off her knees to hand it back to him. In her attempt to touch it as she looked up, she must as little as possible. She misjudged its heaviness, and her hand slipped, nearly dropping it. Her reflexes were quick, and though she caught it by the crank, causing the old brass handle to move forward, when it did, first few beats, a pop goes the weasel rang out in clear, tinny notes. "I thought it didn't work." Deacon excitedly grabbed the Jack-in-the-Box and set it on his own lap. "It didn't. I couldn't get it to turn at all. It must have just been stuck. Guess you loosened it." He tried pulling the pin out once again, but still it refused to budge. He could not see nothing that was preventing the pin from moving, but substance clogging up the latch. But still, it would not move. Shrugging off the disappointment, he grabbed the handle and gave it a gentle push. Effortlessly, the crank moved forward, and the room filled with an eerily rendition of a children's rhyme. Slowly, Deacon tried to hurry it along, turning the crank faster, but it refused to speed up. As the climax of a song approached, Deacon felt his stomach tighten in anticipation, even though he knew the scare wouldn't come because of the stuck pin. Melanie was tensed as well, mesmerized by the languid tune. When the pop rang out, the single note did not disappoint, the lid of the toy jumping at his frame. Melanie gasped and grabbed Deacon's arm, who stared in surprise himself, the vibration of the box's movement still ringing through his hand. A second later, the couple looked at each other and laughed. "Clearly Jack is ready to come out and play," Deacon chuckled, pulling at the pin again. Melanie sighed loudly, shaking off the scare. "Well, I am ready to eat," she informed him, taking the Jack-in-the-Box from his lap, still touching it as little as possible, and setting it on the coffee table next to his lap. "I am craving burgers from May." In truth, she didn't really care where she went. She just wanted to be out of the house and away from the creepy toy. "You got it," he agreed. Dinner at May's had turned out to be an excellent idea. For nearly 2 hours, they sat in a corner sharing food, wine, and stealing kisses while discussing their anniversary plans for the following weekend. After dinner, Melanie asked Deacon to drive her home. She was a lightweight, and when it came to alcohol, she did not want to drive herself home. Unable to convince her to stay at his place, he dropped her off and promised to bring the car she had to work the following day. Entering his place alone, Deacon felt a little lightheaded himself, but decided a single beer wouldn't put him over the top. Grabbing the drink, he flopped down on the couch and looked down at the Jack-in-the-Box, shocked to see the pin, stuck all day despite his best efforts, lay neatly next to the antique toy. Deacon set the unopened beer on the couch next to him, picked up the brass pin, and stared in confusion, unable to reasonably explain how it had come loose and landed so neatly next to the Jack-in-the-Box. "Ready to show yourself?" Deacon almost whispered, as he flipped the latch back and began to turn the crank. Deacon felt strangely apprehensive, and wondered for the briefest moments if perhaps it was better to leave Jack alone. "Maybe I shouldn't have the beer," he said aloud to himself, shaking his head as he listened to the song's slow progression. When the pop came, nothing happened. The box sat motionlessly, not even a thud from within like earlier. Deacon sighed. Now what? He went to the kitchen to retrieve a butter knife. If he had to, he would pry the lid open. Sitting once again in the front of the toy, Deacon raised the knife as the crank began to slowly turn of its own volition, and the tinny song began to slowly play. "I must have cranked it too much," he told himself as he watched in silence. As the pinnacle approached, Deacon was suddenly unsure whether he wanted to meet Jack or not. Before he could decide, the circular leather-covered lid flipped soundlessly open, and a blur of gray and white shot out of the box towards Deacon. More startled than he would ever admit, Deacon jumped and reflexively put up his hand, then cried out as a flash of white-hot pain shot through his arm. "Son of a bitch." Deacon cradled his hand against his chest and stared in disgust at the thing, bobbing up and down on its noisy, antiquated string. 10 inches high minus the spring, it looked more like a corpse than anything else. Certainly not the typical Jack. The spine appearing to grow out of the spring itself, and barely supported the thin, malformed skeleton draped in string-dry flesh. The mouth hung open, revealing a dozen sharp-looking teeth, just below an empty hole where the nose should have been. Above the vacant hole, the eyes were sewn shut with thick strands of black thread. The top of its head came to a lopsided point, the skull almost entirely exposed, except for a few stubborn patches of gray scalp clinging to tufts of yellowed hair. Worst of all were unnaturally long arms and exaggerated fingers that looked more like claws, tipped red with Deacon's blood and pulled close to its desiccated ribcage. His palm throbbed painfully, reminding him that he was injured. Looking down at the rivulets of blood running down his wrist, Deacon angrily backhanded the toy on the table. Satisfied by the noisy way it crashed to the floor before heading up to the bathroom to clean himself. After deciding he didn't need stitches and bandaging up his hand, Deacon returned to the living room, picked up the Jack-in-the-Box, and set it back on the table. Despite his momentary anger, he still thought the toy could be worth something, and hoped he hadn't damaged it with his childish gesture. Tomorrow he would look into taking it to an expert. For now, Jack tucked back inside the box, a task that took far more effort than it should have. Deacon latched the toy, replaced the pin, and went to bed. Just a few hours later, Deacon woke to a sound he knew.